Welcome to Newstalk. I'm your host, Evan Epstein. For more than 4 decades, Ken Burns has shaped how Americans understand their own history. From the Civil War to Vietnam to baseball to the U.S. and the Holocaust, his films have reached millions, defining the narratives through which the country remembers its past, and often how it understands its present. But that work is unfolding in a very different landscape today. Trust in institutions has eroded, the media landscape is fragmented, and debates over truth, polarization, and even political violence have become central to American life. At the same time, Burns has continued to take on some of the most consequential chapters in the country's history, most recently a nearly decade-long project on the American Revolution, with an approach that prioritizes long-form storytelling, historical perspective, and resisting the pull of the present moment. Burns is one of the most acclaimed documentary filmmakers in American history. Over a career spanning more than 45 years, he has produced dozens of films that have become central to the country's historical canon. His work has earned multiple Emmy Awards, Academy Award nominations, and a reputation for bringing depth, nuance, and humanity to some of the most complex stories in American life. This week, we took Newstalk on the road and sat down with Ken Burns at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he was preparing to give a talk at the Institute of Politics, and discussed the role of history in a polarized era, the challenge of truth in a fragmented media landscape, and the future of storytelling. From the Harvard Crimson, I'm Evan Epstein, and this is Newstalk. Ken Burns, thank you so much for joining us today on Newstalk.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with a fairly broad question. You made your first documentary in 1981. It has been 45 years since then. How have you seen your role as a documentarian changing over that time?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that it has. Actually, that film came out in 1981, but it was started in 1977. So we're, 49 years away from when it was started. And I sort of feel a continuity between that person who was working on it. Obviously, I hope I've gotten better as a filmmaker. The people I work with are fantastic. It was a really tiny outfit. We moved from New York City to this little village in New Hampshire just to keep the overhead low, and I stayed. But I think the approach has been the same. A lot of it has to do with the pick that public television sets for me, so that it has one foot in the marketplace and the other defiantly out of the marketplace. And that means that we can take the time to do stuff. The funding is just horrific. It's hard and it takes forever, but, and I could get it from other places, but they wouldn't give me the time that I need to do it. And these are really complicated, labor-intensive works. So I sort of feel like it's the same process. And the real challenge is to stay true to that. The distractions of new technology. We shot film, we edited analog for years and years and years. Everybody switched to computer editing. We stayed analog for another decade. Everybody had left film and it was all, video or just digital, and we stayed another 10 years shooting film, and it was a way to make sure that the technological tail was not wagging the dog. So I think for us it's always how you stay true to the process. Right. And a lot of it is just the hands-on work of trying to figure out how to tell a good story.
It's interesting. Aside from the technological aspect, which you say, or the process, which you say you try to keep the same, is there anything in your earlier works that you would have done differently if you made them today?
I was talking about somebody earlier today that I look at the first film called Brooklyn Bridge, and I probably wouldn't fade to black as many times, but I wouldn't change a thing. I wouldn't go back into it. It's eminently watchable still. I love that film. I remember at one time when we were editing, my wife-to-be was the editor, and I asked her to go and cut out 2 frames. And I found it. Like, she just cut it out arbitrarily, and I found it. I knew it so, I could right now just sit here and recite the film to you. It is that much imprinted on my hard drive. So it's like kids. It's also like, the old photo album where you look back and you go, oh my God, I would never wear that again, But you wouldn't tear it out of the photo album. It's true to who we were.
So Harvard's motto is Veritas. Truth has been upended in our lifetime, politically, the way people talk nowadays, from fake news to AI, there's all of this going on. How possible is it, considering all of this, to still report actual truth in your podcasts and to convince people that what you've shown them is the truth, even if it contradicts their previously held assumptions or the narratives that they believe?
Harvard University was founded in the 17th century,
Yes.
which is a really long time ago. And they were trying to say it's better to have the facts than it is to have the disinformation that was present then. There's always disinformation. People have always lied. It's been in the interests of autocrats to keep people wedded to conspiracies and superstitions rather than that. So this is an age-old problem, and it seems now, because we're in it, that it's got to be worse now than it's ever been, and I don't really know how to judge that. I just know that the word veritas is emphatic, and that it's just something that you do and something that we do. And I can be reminded, I suppose, in my environment that there are all these unreliable sources, but why would you, like hitting your head against the wall, continue to seek them out if it hurt, right? So I've simplified my life, and I tell young people who are always lamenting about this, I said, okay, then just get a subscription online to the New York Times and or the Wall Street Journal and just read that, because you'll be as informed and you won't be distracted by all of this other stuff. I went to another H college down the road in Amherst called Hampshire, and our motto is non satiscire. To know is not enough. And if we accumulate just knowledge without synthesizing it into some form of understanding, there's no truth, there's no veritas. And I like that idea. That's the challenge, to be ever vigilant about that. So yeah, if you want to complain about this stuff, yeah, but you know, I'm sure we've made mistakes in our films, but none have been intentional or conscious.
So similarly, the U.S. is currently in an era of deep political polarization and cultural polarization. How, if at all, does that change the way you think about making your films?
Not at all. I mean, the period of the Revolution, my most recent film is on the American Revolution, and that was a much more divided time, culturally as well as politically and militarily. It was a civil war. It's not just a revolution. It is a very, very bloody civil war, in some ways proportionate in its suffering to the Civil War series, which killed 700,000 of us or more, Drew Gilpin Faust, your past president, proposed. We've had other periods of division, of the Civil War, of the Depression, of World War II, of the Vietnam era. So I think that you have to, I mean, the benefit of history is it gives you the perspectives to see all the things, and then you don't succumb to the dire forecast of this is just the worst time ever. It's bad. It's existentially challenging for us, but I think that it's better to take the fact that we've, you know, come out of really dire circumstances before. I mean, the American Revolution is not a string of patriot victories. It's actually a string of patriot losses, punctuated by a few victories, and we just happen to win the last one.
So there's a recent poll from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights found that 57% of Americans think that another civil war is likely in the near future. I'm guessing from what you've just said that you would disagree with that.
I don't know. I hope it's not the case. I think that the polls reflect a kind of ennui, a kind of world weariness, a kind of boredom, a kind of decadence in which, you know, we've tried out all the narratives, we've tried out all the so-called reality stuff, and, you know, maybe it's going to be in our lives. But, you know, it's divided out there, but it's not like the Civil War. I mean, none of you lived through the Vietnam period. Joe and I did, and there were hundreds of bombings between 69 and 75. Like, if the last bombing you can think of that's in the United States.
Bombings, you mean like within the U.S.?
Yeah, within the U.S. You know, did it go off or did they stop it in time? Or, you know, we have a media culture that is so attuned to everything that everything gets magnified. Like, the promise of television and all the various channels, and then cable and all the even more exponentially more, and then the internet, was that you would have variety. Instead, you have the same thing. And that has this idea of multiplying, almost like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, all the brooms with the buckets of water. And it's really just, you know, I'm waiting for the wizard to come and just go, just one. That's why I say, just get the subscription to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And you know, it doesn't matter what their editorial page is. They've got really good reporters, or the Boston Globe for that matter. You know, they're really good newspapers, and then you don't have to worry about all the stuff that we're supposed to be worrying about. I don't.
And so you think that it is not accurate to compare today to, say, the 1850s or the lead up to the Civil War? You think that People just sort of imagine things to be worse than they are.
People always imagine things to be worse than they are. And in fact, escalating rhetoric does a great deal to ensure that that happens. It's true in the Revolution, it's true in the Civil War. And I think what you have to do is then just pull the fuel rods, particularly in a media culture, pull the fuel rods. It is in the interests of people, many, many people who make a lot of money sowing discord. It just pays. And you ought to be smart enough, instead of wringing our hands and citing the poll about this, be smart enough to say, I'm not going to participate in that thing. And then it won't happen, right? Then you figure out a way to be civically engaged. And what does that mean? How do you compromise? How do you hear someone else? How do you walk a mile in their shoes, as the cliche goes, and figure out where, our genius is figuring out these problems. And when we work together, it's all right. When we don't, it's a mess.
So, moving on from this a little bit, you've said that your new documentary on the American Revolution took you over a decade to make. How did the changes in the country throughout these last 10 years inform the way that you told that story, shaped the way you told it?
So not at all. So it actually took, from the time I said we're doing the American Revolution to when it was broadcast, 9 years and 11 months. When we began, Barack Obama had 13 months to go in his presidency. We released it in November in the midst of all of this madness, right? If you pay attention to how much it's rhyming at any particular time, you're lost. The film is completely dated. So the discipline in the editing room is to go, boy, yeah, it's so much like today, and then just move on. And then there's some things that, back in 2020 were so much like that moment, and then not so much the next year, and other things. So you just, I'll tell you, there's a moment when, at the end of the Constitutional Convention and the ratification, they're worrying, they're reverse engineering an autocrat. They're trying to figure out how to not have an autocrat. And I think if the founders came today, they'd be not surprised that somebody was seeking autocratic power, but they'd be hugely disappointed that Article 1 of their Constitution, the legislative, had abdicated so much. That's where the real sort of disappointment would be, that what, you ceded this, an undeclared war? What? How? Is that we're the people's representatives? You're imposing tariffs? That's our job. A lot of that has been misconstrued. And Hamilton himself said, what if some unscrupulous person were to mount the hobby horse of popularity and create chaos? It's so prescient how much human nature, how prescient they were and how much human nature is the same. They knew about everybody that is today.
You think the same moments from history, that same quote from Hamilton would have been, or has been equally important to hear throughout all of American history? You would have still told that same story 10 years ago as you would now?
Well, I think we tell the same story, but I don't think it would have the resonance. I'll give you another funnier example, which is, we have a wife of a German general who's crossing the ocean to join the British, and her husband's fighting for the British. She's worried because she's heard Americans eat cats. So if the film had come out a year earlier in 24, that's when the whole election cycle, was talking about Americans eating cats in Springfield, Ohio, right? So, when it went by, when we're editing and we're looking at each other, I just realized no one will say anything, and no one has said anything about it. So there are lots of little tiny things. There is a failed invasion of Canada. There is a continent-wide pandemic that kills more people than are killed in battle. There's a huge debate over inoculation. In fact, many historians believe that the greatest military decision that Washington made was to inoculate his troops.
How did he do that?
He was a victim of smallpox, which you give everybody a dose of it, but they have to be isolated. And the anxiety is, of course, if one person comes back and they're still infectious, they can infect other people. Right. And so there's, and the efficacy of that was, it very much on the mind. So a lot of what we think is so unique to our particular moment, there are new forms of communication, there are new ways of traveling of information. There are people, like Franklin, who's a postmaster. There's lots of newspapers. There's a vibrant free press. In some ways, it feels radically different. And of course, we don't have any photographs of them, and they're wearing hose and knee breeches and wigs. But you'd recognize it. You'd go there and you'd say, oh, I know that type. I know that person. I can trust that person. I can trust her. I'm not so sure. And you would make those same decisions.
Do you see documentary filmmaking as needing to adapt to changes in how audiences consume media in the modern world? These documentaries are 10 plus hours long in an era of social media and shortened attention spans and streaming and all of that. Do you think that changes are necessary? Do you think your more traditional approach
I think
still
everybody
works?
always, all real meaning accrues in duration, and the work you're proudest of and the relationships you care about have benefited from your sustained attention. And so I think there's always room to be distracted by a kitten playing with a ball of yarn or an MTV video. I was told when the Civil War series came out in 1990 that no one would watch because of that, and it's still the highest rated program in PBS history. And what do? You've got a tsunami of choices, way more than I have, and you binge. You self-curate, right? And you take stuff and you spend many more hours than my longest film watching a series you might have even seen before and rewatching, episodes. My children do this, so I know that you do this. And so that's dedicating your attention. So yeah, there's room for long form. And I'm in some other little tiny back 40 acres of PBS and educational stuff like that. And what do we see is all this reality, which isn't, but lots of documentaries that are long form and, 8 hours. Is that how many series in The Last Dance on Michael Jordan, right?
Right.
How come this attention span doesn't apply to that? Well, it's because everybody's willing to commit to what they're interested in. If you tell a good story is a good story. And if you do it right, you can hook them in. This film in the American Revolution is huge. It's like over 4 billion minutes of streaming, because somewhere along the line we figured out how to tell a good story with paintings and maps and documents and, live cinematography and some reenactments, and people have responded. Those are big numbers.
And how about with the young people? Is that large amount of streaming mostly from older generations who saw your documentaries in the 90s?
I don't think the older
90s,
generation know
people?
how to stream. No, I'm sure it probably skews an older audience, but it is. I'm always very pleased to see how many people have watched it.
So speaking of modern technology and modern shifts, I want to talk a little bit about AI. In 2002, Steve Jobs personally called you to ask permission to use your name for a digital effect in iMovie, the Ken Burns effect. So that was an example of a tech company asking a filmmaker for consent to use their content. Meanwhile, a few decades later, your documentaries...
It's not my content. He
your
developed a way of panning and zooming
right.
on this stuff, and he did a very superficial version of what we do. And I actually didn't just call me. I went and visited him, and then he said, we'd like to keep the working title, which was the Ken Burns effect. And I said, no, I don't do commercial endorsements. And we ended up with a pretty good deal. He gave me a lot of hardware and software, Apple did, and we gave it to nonprofits.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I ended up the winner because I got a friendship with him until the end of his life, and would stay at his house when I was in the Valley.
Yeah, in that case, at the very least, there was consent involved here in them using your thing.
Indeed.
So, meanwhile, now your documentaries have been used without permission to train AI algorithms, for example. So, do you think that this is emblematic of a larger shift with regards to respect for creative work with AI? Is there a problem going into the future there? Do you see
huge problems? And as the president says, I'm going to sue their asses. Yeah, they've hosed up all of our content and don't think twice about what is copyrighted material.
In a perfect world for you, how would AI companies get the information they need to train their algorithms?
The way we always do when we license a photograph or a bit of footage, we pay for it. There should be a licensing arrangement.
All right, so moving on to politics a little bit. Harvard is currently in a legal battle with the Trump administration to remain independent from the federal government, specifically over who gets to decide what is and isn't taught here. You've been a prominent advocate for PBS, which is facing a similar fight over its independence. Do you think that these are the same fight? Do you think that there's a meaningful difference between Harvard with its $50 billion endowment and PBS, which relies on public funding? Do you think that there's more similarities here? How do you see these?
I think they're really different. One of them is hugely important, which is Harvard being told how to teach or whatever, which is completely un-American. PBS's funding was attacked, not its content, and the reason why its funding was attacked was because some people didn't like its content, even though it was the home of the conservative writer William F. Buckley for 32 years with a show called Firing Line, which is still on and still moderated by a conservative, the great-granddaughter of Herbert Hoover. So, if you look at a normal primetime thing, it's hard to find where the problems are. So all it's done is just set back fundraising and made it more difficult, for stations, rural stations to exist, for the rest of us to do our stuff. But it's a little bit different than the arm of the government coming in and telling Harvard how to do this. I mean, maybe that might happen with PBS down the line, which I hope not.
Right.
But I think it requires the same fortitude and backbone in both institutions to push back vociferously about it. And unfortunately, I think the last year has been a case of a lot of institutions not knowing exactly when to push and when not to push, and so they've ended up sort of tying their own hands for a little bit. So, but it's good to see that on the whole people are beginning to say no.
All right, I have a couple rapid fire questions just quickly to wrap us up here.
I have 10-part answers.
First of all, if you could sit down and interview one historical figure, who would it be and what would you ask them?
Yeah, oh God, Louis Armstrong. He's the most important person in music, I didn't say jazz, in the 20th century. And I was so surprised when we were working our jazz series in the late 90s and came out in 2001, just how central he was. But, you know, I'd like to talk to George Washington. I'd like to talk to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was really the mother of the women's movement. I'd like to talk to Frederick Douglass, who is one of the most phenomenal people. Abraham Lincoln, of course, FDR. You know, there are really amazing people. So.
And final question, if you could teach a class at Harvard, what would you want to teach?
Oh, geez, I don't know. I don't want to teach. I already do. I've got the largest classroom. I would be in America. I want to teach what we do so that we could communicate, like how we make films and how I think it's not necessarily unique, but how I think it's helpful and that it's a combination of history. I mean, I'm a filmmaker and I happen to make films in American history, and that's storytelling, and most of the word history is the word story, and so I guess there's that synergy, and so I'm interested in how a good story is told, so I guess it would be storytelling.
All right, well, Ken, thank you so much for joining us on Newstalk. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Veritas.
This episode of Newstalk was hosted by me, Evan H.C. Epstein, and produced by myself alongside We Be Fam. From 14 Plimpton Street, this is Newstalk.